This is a company called Genome Dynamics International. My name is Dr. Martin Bluth. I'm co-founder of this organization. And briefly put, GDI has a mission to discover and develop new blood tests for difficult to diagnose or difficult to treat diseases. Basically, a blood test, or a biomarker as it's referred to, can often be interpreted in order to diagnose disease. Many of us have loved ones, for example, or ourselves. They go to the physician, we're trying to figure out what is wrong with us, what's going on, what's the diagnosis, we don't know, take a test, take a thing, come back, try a treatment, come back, etc. So there's a delay, there's a time, there's a psychosocial aspect to diagnosing a disease, which many of us are familiar with. A biomarker, as by way of introduction, for those who don't know, would be like your typical PSA, your typical cholesterol, and the like, a blood test. So with regard to the lack of diagnosis, the issue is what is available in the clinical marketplace to diagnose a disease. Many times we won't do this because we're afraid to be biopsied, we don't want the pain, we don't want the invasiveness of many otherwise interrogating type of technologies, and this becomes a problem. Not to mention cost. What's our deductible? Do we have to pay out of pocket? And in general, the strain on the medical marketplace and health insurance is staggering when it comes to healthcare in general, which I'll get to in a moment. So all of this delayed detection can affect mortality and patient care, as well as management from the physician side of the fence in order to treat you well. So what we have here is a blood test discovery system. In our approach, the idea is to either replace or augment non-invasiveness. So many times we'll go in for a biopsy, a blood test, which many of you know will be taken from the arm, no catheterization, no biopsy. You'll be more willing to go to the physician to get your annual screening or whatever the diagnosis testing is, in addition to more effective management. Our blood tests generally cost in the range of $150 to $200, and therefore compared with your basic biopsy, upwards of $2,000, it is a considerable cost savings. So how do we do this? We have a proprietary approach which interrogates the immune system of the patient in order to mine, as it's called, for new blood tests or new diagnostics. Once we come up with these new candidates, we verify them by classical and confirmatory methodologies and submit them to the FDA for approval as a new blood test, which can then be absorbed for a company to be a new panel test for disease. What is the market? Blood testing is not very well understood. Most of the time people in the healthcare industry understand therapeutics, but not so much diagnostics. As you can see, although the data are a little old, the national healthcare expenses are about 2.3 trillion, representative of the 16% GDP, which according to the most recent Journal of American Medical Association is closer to 17.1. So you could see it's probably increased. And laboratory services or diagnostics account for about 10% of this healthcare market, or over $200 billion. The products in the pipeline, which I'll get to in a moment, include those markers for overactive bladder and pancreatic cancer. The overactive bladder one is actually at the point where we're submitting it, we're putting together the technology to submit for an FDA approval in terms of having everything focused. The pancreatic cancer is now at the position of confirmation, but is not yet ready for an FDA submission. Why these markets? The overactive bladder market, which many of you might be familiar with when you see Whoopi Goldberg, presenting commercials on the television for Depends, etc., where there's staining, spotting, or involuntary urination or incontinence, as it's called, is upwards of 40% of the population and reaches approximately a $26 billion healthcare market, which includes medicines as well as Depends, as well as psychosocial, as well as loss of work, as well as not going to the restaurant because you're afraid you're going to stain. So it's very far and wide reaching and actually increases with age and multiple pregnancies. So it is continuously increasing in the population. The issue is it's subjectively diagnosed, often trial and error. Come here, what's the problem? Take a pill, come back in 3 months. If it doesn't work, we'll give you another pill. And it's confirmed about a quarter of these patients will go through invasive urodynamics, which you put a little tube up through the area where you urinate, and I'm sure you can understand the rest. It's not exactly a cakewalk. Pancreatic cancer is much less in incidence, but it carries a death sentence with it, in that the majority of patients who are diagnosed late and have over a greater than 90% mortality rating, in which case this is a very needed blood test, however, although the incidence is low, but still commands a $5 billion market because of long-term health care. In terms of competition, there are many different types of testing. We spoke about invasive testing, such as surgical-based, biopsy-based, of course, if you're going to take a little piece of you out and then send it to the lab. There are DNA-based testing companies out there which will tell you the relative risk of you potentially having a disease, but not necessarily if you have it. You might be a carrier and go mental trying to figure out if you know if you're carrying a gene for X, Y, and Z, but does that mean you're going to actually have the disease? Not necessarily. So GDI, we find, has a benefit, or actually trumps the competition, in that it's patient-friendly, cost-sensitive, as opposed to the many thousands of dollars which I mentioned earlier, and can provide a biomarker pipeline. Whichever disease you want to test, we can develop biomarkers for it. With regard to the OAB marketplace, we have 4 new biomarkers. We confirm them on 40 patients. As I mentioned earlier, the test is about $150 to $200, which would save $1,500 per test, compared with invasive urodynamics for $2,000. And the insurance companies love this. We've already done some marketing, and Blue Cross Blue Shield, Medicare, Medicaid would much rather pay for a $150 screening test than for a $2,000 invasive test. Therefore, the anticipated revenue would be about $1 billion plus per year. Our management team, I'm board certified in clinical pathology, another word for laboratory medicine or diagnostics, as well as board certified in transfusion medicine with a PhD in immunology. Wellman Chung is an expert in urogynecology. Grace Wang and Cynthia Pritchard complete the group by CFO and understanding the finances, as well as quality and making biomarkers become approved through the FDA. So we have the team which will guarantee the success of GDI. In terms of the customers, we have a bunch of different possibilities which are identified in terms of companies that want to develop a new blood test, either for their drug, such as Eli Lilly and the like, or develop something for a particular disease space, including laboratory services, or licensing biomarkers to Quest as a panel test, which will then be available for them for the patients. The spreadsheet that we're looking at, the first 2 years are going to be, of course, a loss because of all the money for FDA submissions, as well as patent costs and the like. We anticipate revenue, and it might seem a little say uncharacteristic to anticipate a multi-million-dollar income. The assumptions on this is if we capture 0.5% of the population of those incontinent, which include those who are about 50 million, at $200 a test, we will pretty much have $50 million revenue. Less, of course, all of these other expenses, FTE time expansion, consumables, etc. In 2015, 1%, and in 2016, 5%, which, as word of mouth in various medical institutions will start promoting this test, will get more play. To create a new disease space, for example, if you want to go after hepatocellular carcinoma, you want to go after any liver cancer, for those who don't know what that is, as well as colon cancer, from start to finish, biomarker discovery and subsequent confirmation, FDA submission, et cetera, and approval is about $1 million. And at this point, for the current pipeline, it's pretty much half of that, because currently the founders, as well as Glaxo and Astellas and Yamanuchi, have put in money to equal about 325. So we're halfway there for the pipeline. As far as what are we doing with the money, much of it is going to be sample recruitment. We have to recruit hundreds of patients in order to determine exactly the implications of use for the test. Consumables, materials, subcontracts, and the likes, FDA filings, patent fees, marketing, and all the things that go into biomarker discovery. With regard to our exit, we've identified a few, and each one of them has value. One, the easiest, I'd say, would be once we get this to market, we would sell it to Quest as an exclusive or non-exclusive license to be put on their panel and offered to the physicians. That's simple and has a considerable revenue stream, which exists within many other markers in this space. The others might be establishment of a boutique laboratory, such as, let's say, GDI, have them strategically placed around the country, where all samples looking for a diagnosis of OAB or pancreatic cancer is going to come to us. This model is very, very substantiated and also lucrative in terms of being able to solicit revenue. And finally, reagents that we promulgate during the course of this will also be available for consumption and selling into laboratory test kits. By way of example, PSA is a $30 billion blood test, just to give you an idea. So with that, GDI, simplifying disease diagnosis. I thank you for your time. Yes.
Oh, there we go. All right, here I come.
Thank you. Amazing. I didn't realize that this is a huge opportunity. I have a couple of questions. The first question is what you ended with, which is PSA being a $30 billion market. That's an immunoassay.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, from a technology hurdle, how that presents a challenge, and in terms of whether it would impact your revenue and commercialization plan or not.
Well, PSA is by way of example because that's for prostate cancer, but what we actually do for each of these tests is we develop a gene test and a protein test, such as ELISA, as you mentioned.
Okay.
So we have multiple avenues of fallback in the event that one has some difficulty or sensitivity. We have the gene test, which is remarkable. We're trying to build a protein test because it's easier.
Okay. The other question, on one of your slides, you said you confirmed or validated on 40 patients. I wasn't sure whether that's your cohort study that you did during your clinical trial, or that's after you did your clinical trial. I'm trying to understand
Yeah.
whether that was statistically significant or not.
That's excellent. No, what we do is we take the patients and controls, isolate the immune cells, interrogate them, come up with markers. What we then do is create the markers and then put them back into the same cohort patient that were originally confirmed by the classical method, which is urodynamics. That's the sort of sine qua non of diagnosis. So we have this, and just like in the mining profile, we had these differences in patients versus controls. The confirmation of these markers, both in the gene test and now in the protein test, also demonstrated the same difference. Now what we're doing is recruiting new sort of prospective studies to people coming into the clinic and collecting them and then seeing how they relate to the gold standard urodynamics test.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Right? We're going to use it so you're clear on film. Thank
Try
you.
to speak slowly and all of that. So from the time you submit it to the FDA, I'm just curious as to the length of time it would take for them to approve it.
All things considered, 3 months,
Pretty quick.
assuming that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And that's why we have Cynthia on board, because she does this for 30 years now, specifically biomarkers for the FDA.
And the grants you're talking about, came from yourselves, other companies, any SBIR, anything like that?
We've submitted, some are still pending, but we haven't gotten SBIR as of right now. Mostly the pharma and, of course, our own pocketbooks and some startup grants have been the mainstay of the funding.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You can hand it back, Fred. Thank you.
Thank you. My question really is more on the expense side than the revenue side. As I look at 2012 and 13, you've got $1 million here. I'm just wondering, how many people was that? Do you think that's enough realistically to get done what you need to get done to come to market?
Well, these are all based on the following assumptions. We're anticipating a test of approximately $16, $17 per test based on the current rate of what one ELISA test would cost to run through the system, plus FTEs that would be running, let's say, 6 tests per day in multiple sets in terms of making this flow through with minimal error. As that requires additional real estate, as that more samples come in and you start requiring consumption of materials and new technology for automation, because the different analyzers are, of course, more expensive for automation, which would be necessary as you go from 250 to 2,500,000 patients, et cetera. So these are assumptions based on what we understand of initial and then ramp-up based expenses. So FTE, consumption, materials, real estate expansion, shipping is also part of this. You have to have a courier. So this is what we've put in as far as where we have derived those numbers.
Yeah, my question more was with 2012 and 13 prior to you delivering.
Oh, this is just in terms of what we anticipate
Development costs.
the cost to get, including patent costs, FDA submission costs, and recruitment costs of a few hundred patients at, let's say, a head count of $100 per patient, because you have to solicit this to the different places that would give you these patient samples, which that money would pay for their nursing staff, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we derive that to get the patient number. Because to confirm, I don't need thousands of patients. I just need hundreds in order to satisfy the FDA mandate. That's why it is within reason.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, fabulous. Oh, I'm sorry, Tom, I didn't see you. Thank you.
In your request, you're asking for 450, which sounds like just enough to finish the OAB
Correct.
development, and yet your plan is to develop markers for other diseases along the way. So how many additional rounds are you going to need, assuming these tests are about $1 million apiece, as you said? And what's the timeline for development of each edition? How long has it taken you to get to where you are and where you anticipate finishing with OAB?
Well, at this point, since it's been pretty much very, I say, limited funding, and it's been fewer FTEs than we would like, it's taken us a couple of years to put everything together. Assuming the funding is appropriate, then that time constraint will no longer be necessary. We anticipate any new blood test, start to finish, with the proper capital, so we can go to Sloan Kettering, Karmanos, et cetera. You're not limited to sort of favors, if you will. It would take under a year, because we'd have the head count, the technology, the funding to hire who we need. Under a year, start to finish, to get markers through an FDA submission, 18 months at the outset.
So your spend rate will be somewhere north of $1 million a year.
For new diseases, start to finish, that's the loose approximation.
Well, that's for the new diseases, but
Yes.
there's the general operating of the company itself. So you're going to have a burn rate in the neighborhood of about $1.5 million a year or so.
We would compensate for that depending on how many FTEs we'd have to take on to shorten the time to get to market. Obviously, it's cheaper at the outlay of paying people if you're going to trickle for 3, 4, 5 years, because that's one person pipetting. If we wind up getting more people to do multiples of the same workload, then we would compensate for both the accounts receivable, the funding needed, and the expenses.
Okay.